Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I just wanted to wish everybody that celebrated yesterday a happy Orthodox Easter. In the Eastern world, in the Eastern Church, it was Easter yesterday. In the Western Church, of course, it was last week. And also a happy holiday to the my Druze watchers, viewers, and listeners. And I wanted to explain a little bit about some of the differences between first Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity, and also what is the Druze religion and how is it different from mainstream Islam. Now, the flag you see on the front is the Druze flag. It represents the Druze religion. The Druze are well known throughout the Middle East, especially the Levant, which is Syria, Palestine, Israel, and Lebanon. And that's where they originate. They originate originally from the Fatimid Caliphate, a caliphate that conquered um, that part of the world, ruled from Cairo in the 11th century. It was the same caliphate that was in power when the Crusade started in 1095. It was an Ismaili caliphate. Remember, we talked about the Battle of Karbala shortly after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. There was a split of dissension of who would of secession, who would succeed the Prophet Muhammad. Would it be those learnt most in Hadith and Quran, or those who were his physical descendants, the Ahlul Bayt, the people within his family, especially from the lineage of Ali, his cousin and son-in-law, and his daughter Fatima bint Zara? Well, the Shia said his daughter, and they said Ali should be the first caliph, and the Sunnis said that Abu Bakr should be the first caliph, and Abu Bakr ended up being the first caliph, and most Muslims are Sunni Muslims. But the Shias never stopped fighting. The Shias never stopped fighting for what they believed in, and finally, Ali becomes the fourth caliph among the Rashidun. He gets murdered, and his son, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, gets murdered and killed as well. This leads to the Battle of Karbala in Iraq and the ultimate split between the two. Then they developed a belief that, according to Islamic eschatology, that at the end of the world there would be an Imam, Imam Mahdi. Now, both sects of Islam believe that Imam Mahdi will come right before Jesus returns to the world, but the Shia sect of Islam, of course, believes that he must come from the lineage of the Prophet Muhammad, from that direct lineage, and he must be of the Ahlul Bayt. And some of them believe that he already did come. And the different sects of Shiaism break down like this. Some believe that he came and he was the seventh descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, like the Ismailis. Some believe he was the sixth descendant. And the predominant sect of Shiaism, which is practiced in Iran, the Ashiris, which was taken on by the Safavid dynasty in the 13th and 14th century. The enemies to the Ottomans were ruling in the west, the Safavids were ruling in the east, is the predominant school of Shiaism. But another school of Shiaism, of course, were the Ismailis, who believed that Imam Mahdi was the seventh descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. And this sect of Islam began to predominate in the 11th century in the Middle East. And they started the Fatimid Caliphate. Of course, the Fatimid Caliphate for Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. So, who the Shias, all the Shias, Sixers, Seveners, and Twelvers, venerate. They took over the whole region from the Abbasids because the Abbasids were ruling in Baghdad, were pretty weak at the time. They were pretty disorganized. So the Fatimids who came in from Cairo, which at that time was called Fustat, were able to conquer it. And the sixth caliph of um, the Fatimid dynasty, Al-Hakim, became a follower of this Sheikh al-Daruzi, who started to preach this heretical version of Islam. So, in other words, he was really going against the Quran. He was not just interpreting certain hadiths for this and certain hadiths for that. He was actually going against the Quran, and he was actually saying something completely different from the Quran. One of the main things that he was preaching that was different was reincarnation. Of course, traditional Islam doesn't believe in reincarnation. Traditional Islam believes in Jannah and Jahannam, heaven and hell. But this one sheikh, he started to preach that all the prophets were like reincarnations. I mean, Al Hakim was like a reincarnation of all the prophets: Jesus, Plato, Aristotle, even Greek philosophers. They were all in the same line. And one of the people that they said that Al Hakim was um, a manifestation of, or an incarnation of, besides God Himself, was um, Shaib, who we know in the Bible, Christians do, as Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. So they believe that this father-in-law of Moses is their actual physical descendant. So on this day, their holiday, they celebrate the birthday of Shaib, the uh, founder of their faith, which they believe is the purest form of monotheism. They call themselves the Ahli Muhahadin, which is the people of monotheism. They believe their version of monotheism is even more pure than that of even Muslims. And Muslims, they champion monotheism. They talk about Tawheed and stuff. So, but the Druze, they believe their version is even more um, monotheistic. And of course, they believe in reincarnation. They do not believe in converts because I guess they believe that their believers reincarnate each time. The book of converts for them was closed with Al Hakim, who again they believe to be a reincarnation of not only these prophets, but an actual reincarnation of God Himself. And their teachings are very secretive, and that's for a reason. They practice heavy taqiyya because for years and years they've lived under the thumb of various Shia groups like the Ismailis or various other Shia groups like the Ash'aris, the predominant Shia groups within the Eastern Mediterranean like Hezbollah, and also the Sunnis. So if the Sunnis and them found out that they had these heretical beliefs, they would then kill them. You know what I mean? Because we saw what happened with the Baha'is in Persia, the Ahmadis in India and Pakistan, and even the Sikhs in India when they tried to expand the Muslim understanding of God to something different. Muslims, Orthodox Muslims to traditional Muslims, both Sunni and Shia, they weren't having it, and they persecuted them and they killed them. In all these instances, even here in the United States, Nation of Islam and stuff. But since we live here in the United States, Orthodox Muslims and stuff, people that come from the Muslim world, they just engage in debates. They don't have real power to really do anything here in the United States. So they just, you know, debate with you online. They call you a kafir, they call you a disbeliever and stuff like that online. They don't have no power to kill you or anything. But in a Muslim society with a Muslim rulership, like the Fatimids or the Abbasids at that time in the 11th century, yes, um, they had the power to do that. And subsequently, after that, they were under the Ottomans, and the Ottomans and the Mamelukes had the power to do that as well. But Al Hakim is notorious in our um, in our history here in the West because he burned down the church. He's alleged to have burned down the church, the Holy Sepulchre, and he was having Christian pilgrims killed, and that was the impetus that gave Pope Urban II in the 1090s to recapture Jerusalem on the behalf of the Byzantines and start the First Crusade, where Godfrey of Bouillon was successful. That's the famous crusade that we all know about. The one that apparently there was so much blood that there was blood up to the knees of the Crusaders. That's the one where they won. That made Godfrey of Bouillon one of the nine worthies. This caliph, this Fatimid caliph, Al Hakim, was known for doing that because he was considered Majnun, in Arabic Majnun. He was considered heretical even by the Sunnis. So it's interesting that the Druze venerate him. He was persecuting Sunnis, he was persecuting other Shias, he was persecuting Christians, and I don't know about Jewish people, but he was the leader of this Druze community. Nowadays, the Druze community is very well acquainted with the West. They're the only group of Arab people who serve in the IDF. Other groups of Arabic people are the Israeli Defense Forces. Other groups of Arab people are excluded from the IDF. They're not allowed to serve because of course, conflict of interest. And interesting that if Israel doesn't believe that they're doing anything egregious to Israeli Arabs, they would allow every Israeli Arab citizen, irrespective of religion, Sunni, Christian, Druze, whatever, Shia, whatever, to serve in the military, but they don't because obviously they know that they are doing something egregious to not only Israeli Arabs but to Palestinians in the occupied territories as well. That's just my opinion. Now, going back to the Crusades, and this ties into the differences among Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Catholic or Protestant Christianity. During the Crusades, of course, the Byzantine Empire had lost a tremendous amount of territory. Most of the territory in North Africa, especially Egypt, was lost to the Arabs, to the expansion of the Arabs, the original Umayyad Caliphate out of Syria. Then as the Abbasids got on when they took over, the uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, Abbas, he got on and the territory expanded even further, and more territory by the Byzantines. Traditional Ionian Greek-speaking territory was lost. Even in Anatolia, which is today's Asia Minor, was lost. And the Byzantines were very weak at that time. There was a famous battle at that time. It was on my birthday. It's called the Battle of Manzikert, in which the Byzantines suffered tremendously. So part of the reason was this mad caliph, this mad Fatimid caliph. Another reason was the movement from the east, from Eastern Central Asia, of the Seljuk Turks to the Western Middle East and how they were treating Christians. And part of the reason was the loss of the Byzantines. The Byzantines had appealed to help from the West, particularly Pope Urban II in the 1090s. And this was advantageous because by the time 1054 rolled around, eastern branches and western branches of Christianity had split up. Rome, when the church first started, when Christianity first began, even before Constantine became a Christian in the 4th century, there were several bishops in different parts of the Christian world. There was a bishop of Alexandria in Egypt, a bishop of Antioch in Syria, a bishop of Rome, of course. There were several different bishops throughout the Christian world, and the Pope in Rome was only just one bishop. But because of the barbarian invasions in the 4th and 5th century during the collapse of Rome, because of that, the Pope began to acquire, because he was able to negotiate with the barbarians, particularly like Pope Leo the Great with Attila the Hun, right? When he invades Rome in 410. the Pope begins to acquire not only a religious status, but a political status as well, above the offices of the Patriarch in Constantinople, which is supposed to be the political heartland of the whole of Christianity. Remember, the center of Rome was moved from Rome, the original Rome of Romulus and Remus, to Constantinople by Constantine, which today is modern day Istanbul. But the Eastern Roman Empire, which Western scholars would later come to call the Byzantine Empire, had lost tremendous amount of power. So they're now, with the unification of the Western tribes, particularly under the Franks, on Christmas Day in 800, under Charlemagne, and the defeat of the Moors in Poitiers in 732 in the Battle of Tours with Charles Martel, Charlemagne's great-grandfather. The Eastern Church is now appealing to the power of the West, because the West has become so much more powerful and so much more united. They're facing the trouble of the Seljuks, they're facing the trouble of the Fatimids, and they're facing the trouble of, Islam in general, and they need this help. So the Pope sees it as a power grab and sees it as a way to reunify the two branches of Christianity that split up in 1054. In what Christian historians call the Great Schism. Eventually, they would develop different theological points too. The West would, because of Augustine, the West would emphasize the doctrine of original sin, and they would also emphasize that the Holy Spirit on the Feast of Pentecost emanated from the Father and the Son, and not just like the Orthodox say the Father. But one of the points of contention was the two calendars. Now, this really wasn't a point of contention at the time, because at one time, what was the former Roman Empire, from the time of 45 AD, with Julius Caesar, they all used the same calendar. But then, towards the late 16th century, Europeans and Western Christians, Catholics and Protestants in particular, started to use the Gregorian calendars, correcting some of the mistakes, with further knowledge. So Orthodox Christianity and Western Christianity split on that end as well. So not only are they split culturally, where the Orthodox Christians speak Greek in their liturgy and the Western Christians speak Latin, not only are they split politically, where the Pope is viewed as the head of the church, he's viewed as the descendant or the spiritual descendant of St. Peter. He sits on the see of St. Peter. He's a political leader. He is like a king, but not a king in the West. But now they're even split, as far as their holidays, when they celebrate Easter or when they celebrate Christmas, for example, the East and the West. And of course, the Fourth Crusade was terrible for the East, because the West invaded Constantinople and looted Constantinople and took all of Constantinople's treasures in an attempt to get one of the emperors back on his throne. He felt that his throne was usurped. So he employed the Western Crusaders to try and do so. And Constantinople really never recovered. And in 1543, the Ottoman Turks took Constantinople, and that was the really end of Eastern Christendom, or so we thought. The power of Eastern Christendom would switch from Constantinople in the Greek-speaking world to that of Russia. Now, also with another thing that happened in the 10th century, in addition to the development in the Levant of this Levantine native religion, the Druze, was also the development of Russia becoming, or the Kievan Rus which is based in Ukraine, the modern day Ukraine. Ironic, right? Becoming Christian. In 988, Vladimir the First has this he wants to give up the old traditions, the pagan traditions, pagan European traditions. Swedish sailors in the early 9th century were the ones that arrived in Kievan Rus and settled it and gave them the name. But he wants, and they, of course, they married with the Slavic peoples, who the Romans called the Fenti. Right? He wanted to give up his old pagan beliefs and embrace something more cosmopolitan. So he asked the Jews, he asked the Muslims in Bulgar and the Volga River. There were already Muslims there, and he asked the Christians, you know, which one should I choose? He didn't choose the Jews because he said, well, they lost their temple, they have no political power. In the grand scheme of things, in the battling between world powers and world principalities, becoming Jewish doesn't benefit me in any way. The two biggest principalities are Christians and Muslims. So I'm going to either embrace one of these two religions. Well, he talks to the Imam, the Muslim of the Muslims, and he figures out, listen, this religion, first of all, he said that the people were unhappy and they didn't really bathe all that much, which I really don't believe, because according to Muslim tradition, you must perform wudu, absolution of water right before you make salah 5 times a day. So I don't really believe that, but that's what he said. And also the prohibition on alcohol. He said, well, what is the rules without alcohol? So in 988, Vladimir I becomes Christian. He gets in touch with he sends envoys to Constantinople, and he sends envoys to Germany, which was the nearest Catholic kingdom at that time. Because Germany was, of course, divided into several principalities, the Holy Roman Emperor, right? At that time. He doesn't like the Western architecture, so he says, no, I'm not doing the Western architecture. But across the Black Sea, in Constantinople, he sends envoys there, and he likes the beauty of Constantinople. So they send St. Cyril to convert him to Orthodox Christianity. So when Constantinople falls to the Turks, Russia, over time, especially after the Mongols come in, right, they take over all of Russia, they establish the Golden Horde. Then Ivan the Terrible kicks them out, and he reunites Russia in the 13th and 14th centuries. He reunites Russia, and Russia then becomes a superpower. Starts to become a superpower. And around the same time, they become the representation of Eastern Orthodox Christianity up until the dissolution of Eastern Orthodox Christianity in 1917 with the onset of the Bolsheviks, and then in 1922 with the triumph of the Soviet Union. Of course, communism wipes out religion altogether, but before that, every time there would be a battle between Islam and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, it was Russia and Russian proxy civilizations such as the Ukrainians. They were always on the front lines, being the representatives of, or carrying the mantle of, Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And in many ways today, in the post-Soviet Union world, Russia is still the prime example of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. One of the things the Greeks did that was interesting was, although they modified their writing, because of course the language of the Eastern Roman Empire, the language of the Eastern Orthodox tradition was Greek, they modified their writing into a similar but different type of writing than the Russians. And they invented the Cyrillic script, which directly relates to St. Cyril religion to Russia. So, happy Orthodox Easter to Eastern Orthodox fans and friends, and happy holiday to the Druze people celebrating uh, the birthday of Nabi Saub or Jethro. The Druze religion is very interesting. It is one of these religions, like the Alawis and even the Yazid, that you don't really hear about in terms of the Middle East. You know what I mean? You always hear about mainstream Sunni Islam and the four Madhabs in mainstream Sunni Islam, the Shafi, the Hanafi, the Hanbali, the Maliki, etc. But and then you hear about Shia Islam, right? The one from Iran. But you never really hear about these other branches of Shia Islam, like the Druze. They don't, like I said, they don't consider themselves as Muslims, but the religion is derived from Islam, and I call it sort of a post um, Islamic religion because throughout the Middle East and throughout the Muslim world, you have these post Islamic religions. You have, um, like I said, Baha'is, which came about in the 19th century. You have the Ahmadis, which also came about in the 19th century as a result. They were kind of responses to Western dominance in the world. One was a response coming from a Shia Iranian experience. The other was a response coming from more of a Sunni Indo-Pakistani experience. And then you have the Ismailis, who they actually Ismailis, um, you know, went through so much persecution in the Muslim world that their headquarters is actually in India, Bohar, India, with their leader. They have like a sort of leader like that's in it, like an Islamic pope, a spiritual slash political leader named Aga Khan. So that is the parent religion of the Druze. They come out of the Shia, the Shia Ismaili sect. Interesting, kind of interesting in my opinion because like I was telling somebody, when I came into Islam years ago, I was taught that there was only one Islam. There was a pure version of Islam. There was the Salafi version of Islam. It's kind of like that with Christianity, kind of like that with Judaism. Like with Judaism, we see like what is the representation of Judaism all the time. We see as Ashkenazi Judaism, Judaism with the cultural trappings of Eastern European and Germanic settings. Also centered a lot in the Ukraine, Uman especially. Um, but you don't hear about the Sephardics that were from Spain and Portugal, the Mizrahi that were from Iraq, Iran, or Temani that were from Yemen, or the Beni Israel that were from India, especially the Cochin region, southern India, that were part of trading communities. Or the Beta Israel, the Falashas that were in Ethiopia that go all the way back to Solomon and Sheba in the Bible, when Israel was the predominant kingdom and they were trading with other kingdoms. Some say India does as well, especially the southern Indians, what they call the black Jews of India, not the northern Indians that came as a result of Islamic expansion, particularly from Baghdad. There was some persecution in Baghdad of Jews, and they went over to India, just like the Parsis, just like the Ismailis. Um, they went over to India, but those are what they call the white Jews, the Beni Israel, the black Jews of India from southern India. They came as a part of trading communities, same as the Nestorian Christians that are on the Malabar coast, the St. Thomas Church, which the Bible says comes from St. Thomas the Apostle, who traveled to India. But later genetics proves that probably was the story. Probably wasn't true. They came as a result of trading communities. Same way how Islam arrived in Sri Lanka. We talked about, in the other video about Sri Lankan persecution. It arrived from the Middle East in trading communities. It's just like with this thing with Vladimir II. I was watching this video. Somebody was talking about Alfonso King Alfonso V of Congo and why he became a Christian under the Portuguese, or why did Sundata Keita and later Mansa Musa of Mali in West Africa become Muslim? Because when you try, and also the Moros of the Philippines, who of course had a famous rebellion against the Spanish, famous rebellion against the Japanese in World War II, and famous rebellion against the Americans when the Americans came in there in in the 1890s. It's because when there is a larger community, you know, you want to be plugged in economically to that community, so you begin to adopt the cultural traits of that community, so you can, through religion and through custom, you can experience the cosmopolitanism of that community. It's sort of just the same thing, just a kind of cultural diffusion that other smaller countries experience when they adopt American ways of life and American ways of thinking. For example, Japan, after World War II, it's the same exact thing. Japan was, from the time of Commodore Matthew Perry in, I know it sounds funny because of Chandler Bing from Friends, but from the time of, um, you know, the latter half of the 19th century, when Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Japan. See, first in the 15th century, the Portuguese arrived in Japan, but they were closed out. There was a rebellion in Japan of Christians. You know, Christianity really appealed to the peasantry in Japan, but you know, the powers that be that were heavily Buddhist at the time, they weren't trying to have it. They weren't trying to have any sort of foreign influence that would influence the peasant uprising. So they quelled the peasant uprising, and then all the doors to trade were shut to the Japanese until Commodore Perry came in the latter half of the 1800s. And already the Japanese, adopted the Meiji Restoration. We saw it in the movie Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, and they became heavily militaristic and heavily industrialized until they became too militaristic and too industrialized, and Pearl Harbor happened, and then the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened. But again, because America was the top economic power at the time, an economic powerhouse, it was beneficial for them to trade with them. Same thing happened here. Byzantine Empire was the economic powerhouse of the time. Islam was an economic powerhouse at the time. The Holy Roman Empire, which was German, was an economic powerhous at the time. So it'd be, of course, advantageous for these pagan kings that are not plugged into cosmopolitanism to trade with them. Anyway, peace. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Happy Orthodox Easter and Druze holiday to Orthodox people and Druze in the Middle East and the world. Peace. Love you guys.